800 men rode out to face 30,000, not in desperation, not because they had no choice. They rode out because one man opened the gates of Muret, looked at the largest army in the southern France, and decided that sitting behind walls was how you lost. Across the field, Peter II of Aragon watched them come, King of Aragon, the man who 12 months earlier had helped shatter the Almohad Caliphate. He had 30,000 men, every advantage a medieval commander could ask for. He had 2 hours left to live. By the time the afternoon was over, Peter II was dead in the mud, unrecognized among common soldiers. 30,000 men, shattered. And Simon de Montfort, with fewer knights than some lords brought to a tournament, had won one of the most impossible victories in medieval history. This is not a story about numbers. This is a story about what happens when a man mistakes his reputation for armor. Welcome to the Clash of Ancients. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, new battle every week. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Here is what most accounts of Muret get wrong. They frame it as a miracle. 800 knights against 30,000 men. The math is so absurd that historians reach for the word providential, or lucky, or inexplicable. The Crusader sources called it the hand of God. Modern readers call it an anomaly. Neither explanation is honest. Muret was not a miracle. It was the collision of one man's tactical genius with another man's fatal overconfidence. And the civilization that paid the price for that collision was not the one that lost the battle. To understand Muret, you need to understand what southern France was in 1213. Languedoc, the region stretching from the Rhône to the Pyrenees, was not France. Not culturally, not linguistically, not politically. It was a world of troubadours and merchant cities, of a tolerant, sophisticated urban culture that had produced some of the finest poetry in medieval Europe. Its cities, Toulouse, Carcassonne, Béziers, were among the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan in the Western world. Merchants traded across religious lines. Scholars debated philosophy in languages that France proper had not yet heard. Women held property and political voice in ways that would have been unthinkable north of the Loire. And into this world had come the Cathars, not invaders, not foreigners. They were locals, weavers, merchants, minor nobles. See, village priests who had grown disillusioned with a Catholic church they considered corrupt, worldly, and spiritually hollow. The Cathar faith rejected the material world entirely. No churches, no sacraments, no pope. Just a direct relationship between the soul and God lived out in radical simplicity. Rome called it heresy. The people of Languedoc, by and large, called it their neighbors. In 1208, Pope Innocent III had called a crusade, not against Muslims in the Holy Land, against Christians in southern France. The Albigensian Crusade had been running for 5 years by the time of Muret. 5 years of siege, massacre, and systematic destruction. The sack of Béziers in 1209, where crusaders killed an estimated 7,000 to 20,000 civilians, had announced what kind of war this would be. The commander reportedly asked how to distinguish heretics from Catholics in the city. The answer, when it came, became one of the most infamous sentences in medieval history. Kill them all. God will know his own. Simon de Montfort had led that crusade for 4 of those 5 years. A Norman French nobleman of modest origins and extraordinary military ability, he had carved out a domain in Languedoc through sheer force of will and tactical ruthlessness. He was not a popular man in the south. He was feared, which is a different thing and in war often more useful. He was also, by 1213, politically isolated. The French crown had not committed fully to the crusade. Many northern lords had taken their 40 days of crusading service and gone home. The Pope was growing impatient, and in the south resistance was hardening. 5 years of crusade had not broken Languedoc. It had united it against Simon de Montfort. By 1213, the crusade had reached a crisis. Peter II of Aragon had watched the systematic dismantling of Occitan lordships with growing alarm. The lords of the south were his vassals. Their culture was his culture. He was himself a patron of troubadour poetry, a sophisticated cosmopolitan king who moved between the courts of Iberia and Languedoc with equal ease. And the crusade was not just destroying Cathar heretics. It was destroying the political structure of a region that Peter II regarded as his natural sphere of influence. He had leverage. He had just returned from Las Navas de Tolosa, July 1212, where a coalition of Iberian Christian kingdoms had inflicted a catastrophic defeat on the Almohad Caliphate. And Peter II was the most celebrated military figure in the Western Mediterranean. The Pope owed him. The lords of southern France needed him. And Simon de Montfort, whatever his tactical gifts, was a minor nobleman facing a king. Peter II marched north in the summer of 1213 with approximately 30,000 men, Aragonese knights, Toulousain infantry, Occitan militia forces, and laid siege to Muret, a small fortified town on the Garonne that Simon de Montfort was using as a base. The trap looked perfect. It wasn't. Simon de Montfort arrived at Muret on September 11th, the day before the battle, with his relief force. He rode into a situation that should have been hopeless. Peter's coalition surrounded Muret on 3 sides. The Garonne River covered the 4th. The Allied force outnumbered the total crusader strength in the region by a ratio that made relief seem less like a military operation and more like a gesture. His officers assessed the position carefully. The walls of Muret were defensible, not forever, but long enough that Peter II might negotiate, might withdraw, might lose the political will to maintain a siege through autumn. Supply lines for a force of 30,000 men are not easy to maintain. Time and hunger do what swords sometimes cannot. The rational course was clear: hold the walls, wait, and let the coalition fracture under its own weight. Simon de Montfort listened to every word. Then he went to the chapel and prayed for 3 hours. What he decided when he emerged was not rational. It was not cautious. It was the decision of a man who understood one thing about his situation that pure mathematics could not capture: that sitting behind walls against 30,000 men was a slow way to lose, and that speed, pure, committed, almost reckless offensive speed, was the only weapon he had that Peter II could not match with numbers. Here is the tactical reality of Muret that the miracle narrative consistently obscures. Peter II's army was a coalition, and coalitions are structurally fragile in ways that a unified command never is. Aragonese knights, Toulousain infantry, Occitan militia. 3 different forces with 3 different commanders, 3 different chains of command, and 3 different ideas about how this battle should be fought. Raymond VI of Toulouse, the count who had the most to lose from a crusader victory, was present but passive, his relationship with the church complicated by years of excommunication and negotiation that had left him politically paralyzed. He was a man trying to fight a war while simultaneously proving to the Pope that he wasn't a heretic. That kind of internal contradiction does not produce decisive military action. The infantry, the bulk of Peter's 30,000, was positioned across the Garonne, not across the field, across the river, a full water crossing away from the cavalry engagement. They were functionally spectators before the battle even began. 30,000 men reduced to an audience by geography and poor coordination. Peter's cavalry, his Aragonese knights, his real striking force was the operational army. Strong, say experienced, battle-hardened at Las Navas de Tolosa just 12 months prior, led by a king who had personally charged the Almohad line and broken it. On paper, more than sufficient to destroy 800 crusader knights, even without the infantry. But here is what Peter II did not do in the hours before the battle. He did not establish a formal battle order. He did not position his cavalry in prepared formation against the gates of Muret. He did not post scouts to watch for a sortie. He did not, apparently, seriously consider that Simon de Montfort, outnumbered 30-1, trapped behind stone walls, might choose to attack. No rational commander with 800 men attacks 30,000. It simply does not happen. Every military calculation in the medieval world said the man behind the walls stays behind the walls and negotiates. Or which is precisely why Simon de Montfort did not stay behind the walls. September 12th, morning. Simon organized his knights into 3 divisions with surgical precision, a van to strike first and hard, a main body to exploit whatever gap the van created, and a rear guard to cover against counterattack from the flanks. He assigned specific targets to each division. He gave specific orders about pace, about formation, about what to do if the first charge did not break the Aragonese line cleanly. Then he opened the gates of Muret, and 800 knights rode toward 30,000 men. Nobody in that field, on either side, believed what they were seeing. The night of September 11th, 1213 was warm, the tail end of a southern French summer, the air carrying the smell of the Garonne and the distant fires of the besieging camp. So in Peter II's camp, the mood was not urgent. Why would it be? The siege was progressing. The town was contained. Negotiations had been attempted. Peter had actually sent envoys to Simon proposing terms, a political solution that would have avoided battle entirely. Simon had refused, which was baffling, frankly, to men who looked at the numbers and saw no scenario in which 800 knights threatened 30,000. Peter II himself spent part of the night, according to later chroniclers, who were not sympathetic, in the company of a woman. Whether this is true or crusader propaganda designed to explain his death as divine punishment is impossible to verify. What is documented is that he did not spend the night reorganizing his battle order, repositioning his infantry across the Garonne, or preparing for the possibility that Simon de Montfort might do something insane. He did not believe insane was on the table. In Muret's chapel, Simon de Montfort knelt on stone for 3 hours. His knights, 800 men who had been fighting this crusade for years, who had besieged cities and burned villages and ridden through country that hated them, prepared their horses and their armor in the dark. No speeches are recorded, no great declarations. These were professional soldiers who had been told they were riding out in the morning against a force 30 times their size, and they were checking their equipment because that is what professional soldiers do. One thing is recorded. Before he mounted, Simon de Montfort reportedly told his men that they were not fighting for land or for glory. They were fighting because there was no other option left. Sometimes that is enough. Stop for a moment. Before we get to the charge, the numbers, the tactics, the outcome, remember what Muret actually was. Thousands of men on that field had no personal stake in the Cathar heresy or in papal authority or in the political rivalry between Aragon and France. They were soldiers doing what soldiers are told to do. The Occitan militiamen who would die in the rout that afternoon were not theologians. They were farmers and craftsmen who had picked up weapons because their lords had called them. And the Cathars themselves, The people this crusade was supposedly about were not on the field at all. They were in their villages, waiting to find out who would govern them next. Does a battle decide the right answer to a theological question? Or does it only decide who gets to keep asking it? The gates of Muret opened at mid-morning. Simon de Montfort's first division came out at a canter, not a full charge, not yet. Controlled speed, the kind of pace that preserves the horses for the moment of impact while covering ground fast enough that the enemy cannot properly respond. 800 men in tight formation, moving with the disciplined coherence of soldiers who had been told exactly what to do and had decided, somewhere in the night before, that they were going to do it. Peter II's cavalry was not in formation. This is the critical detail that the miracle narrative buries every time it reaches for the word providential. The Aragonese knights were present. They were experienced. They were brave. These were men who had ridden at Las Navas de Tolosa and broken the greatest Islamic army in the Western Mediterranean. But they had not expected a sortie. The idea that Simon de Montfort would open his gates and charge had not been seriously entertained. And so when the gates opened and the first Crusader division appeared and began moving across the field, the Aragonese cavalry was in the process of organizing, horses being readied, formations being assembled, commands being passed down a chain of command that had not yet fully established itself for the morning. In medieval cavalry combat, formation is everything. A knight in formation, with his flanks covered and his momentum coordinated with the men beside him, is a fundamentally different weapon from a knight caught individually, horse not fully gathered, or lance not yet couched, eyes still adjusting to what is coming across the field. The difference between a formed cavalry charge and an unformed one is not a matter of courage or skill, it is a matter of physics. Coordinated mass moving together hits differently than the same mass moving in pieces. Simon's first division did not find an army. They found a crowd of armed men in the process of becoming an army. They hit them before the process was complete. The impact was catastrophic and immediate. The Aragonese cavalry, the real striking force of Peter's entire coalition, the veterans of Las Navas de Tolosa, broke before they could form. Not because they were cowards, not because they lacked skill or experience or will, because the timing had been stolen from them before the engagement began, because Simon de Montfort had understood that surprise at the right moment is worth 10,000 men. Peter II rode into the melee personally. Of course he did. This is where his story ends, and where the central paradox of Muret becomes complete and irreversible. He was brave, genuinely, documentably, historically brave, a king who had led from the front his entire career, who had charged the Almohad line at Las Navas de Tolosa and come out the other side alive and victorious. He did not ride into the fighting because he was reckless, or because he had lost his judgment. He rode in because that is what he had always done. Because his entire reputation, the reputation that had made him the most celebrated military figure in the Western Mediterranean, had been built on exactly this: personal courage at the moment of crisis. Because 30,000 men were watching from across that field, and a king of Aragon does not hide behind his cavalry when the battle turns. He was not recognized. In the chaos of a medieval melee, the noise beyond description, dust rising from the field, visors down, no clear lines between friend and enemy, men and horses moving in every direction at once, Peter II of Aragon was just another knight on a horse. There was no banner above him, no circle of guards keeping the enemy at a distance. He had ridden into the fighting the way a common knight rides in, anonymously, dangerously, without the protective distance that rank should have provided. He was unhorsed, he was killed, and his identity was only confirmed afterward. When someone finally looked at his face among the dead and recognized the King of Aragon lying in the mud of a French riverbank. The moment his household knights understood that their king was down, they broke. Not retreated, broke. The psychological collapse was total and instantaneous. An army fights for many reasons: pay, loyalty, ideology, fear. But a coalition army fighting under a king fights above all for the king. Remove the king and you remove the reason. The Aragonese cavalry that had held its nerve through the initial crusader charge simply ceased to function as a coherent force the moment Peter II fell. And when the Aragonese cavalry broke, the entire coalition psychology collapsed with it. Here is what 30,000 men actually are, without a command structure holding them together. A crowd. A very large, a very frightened crowd, suddenly aware that the battle they believed they were winning has somehow, impossibly, inexplicably, already been lost. The Toulousain infantry across the Garonne, tens of thousands of men who had never crossed the river, who had watched the cavalry engagement from a distance without being able to distinguish what was happening, now watched their cavalry dissolving into a rout moving toward them. They did not advance. They ran. Simon de Montfort's 2nd and 3rd divisions pursued without mercy across the open ground. The rout ran for miles along the Garonne, crusader cavalry cutting down fleeing infantry in the fields, on the riverbank, at the water's edge. The river itself claimed hundreds who attempted to cross it in panic, see their armor pulling them under in water that did not care which side they had fought for. The exact casualty figures are disputed. They always are in medieval warfare, where chroniclers on both sides had reasons to exaggerate. But every source agrees on the scale and the completeness of the disaster. Thousands dead. Peter II among them. The coalition shattered so thoroughly that it never meaningfully reformed. Simon de Montfort counted his dead that evening. The sources say the number was almost insultingly small for a force that had charged 30,000 men. And now, the part that complicates the victory completely. Simon de Montfort had just won the battle that saved the Albigensian Crusade, the same crusade that had opened with the massacre at Béziers, the same crusade that was systematically destroying the most culturally sophisticated civilization in medieval France. His tactical genius at Muret did not serve a noble cause. It served the suppression of an entire people, their faith, their poetry, their language, their way of organizing the world. The man who won Muret was brilliant. He was also, by the standards of his own century, and certainly by ours, engaged in something that history has found very difficult to justify. Courage and atrocity are not opposites. Sometimes they ride out of the same gate together. Peter II was buried at Sigena in Aragon. He left behind a 9-year-old son, the future James I of Aragon, who would grow up to be one of the great medieval kings, the conqueror of Majorca and Valencia. History was not done with the House of Aragon. But at Muret, on September 12th, 1213, the House of Aragon lost the one man who might have stopped what came next. What came next was the completion of the Albigensian Crusade, and with it, the systematic absorption of Languedoc into the French royal domain. The troubadour culture that Peter II had patronized and protected did not survive the decade. The poets dispersed. The courts that had supported them were dismantled or brought under French authority. The Cathar faith was driven underground, then extinguished over the following century by the Inquisition, another institution that Muret helped make possible, another mechanism of suppression that the battle's outcome had made inevitable. The rich, tolerant, polyglot civilization of the Occitan South, the culture that had produced some of the finest vernacular poetry in medieval Europe, that had sustained a religious plurality unmatched anywhere in the Western Christian world, was replaced by something harder, more uniform, more French. The language itself retreated. Occitan, which had been the prestige language of Southern Europe's literary culture, became a regional dialect, then a peasant tongue, then a historical curiosity. All of it traced back to one afternoon on the Garonne. Simon de Montfort did not live long enough to fully enjoy his victory. He continued campaigning in the south until 1218, when a stone from a mangonel, reportedly operated by women defending the walls of Toulouse, struck him in the head and killed him instantly. His son continued the crusade. The French crown eventually absorbed it entirely, all completing the conquest that Muret had made inevitable and reaping the political benefits that Simon de Montfort had bled to create. The Cold Open asked, "What happens when a man mistakes his reputation for armor?" Peter II's answer is written in the mud of the Garonne floodplain. Reputation is built in the past, battles happen in the present, and the present does not care what you did at Las Navas de Tolosa. The present only cares whether your cavalry is in formation when 800 knights come through an open gate. Peter II rode into the melee because his entire career had taught him that personal courage was the highest expression of kingship. He was not wrong. For most of his life it had worked. What Muret revealed is the limit of that lesson. Courage without formation is just exposure. Bravery without positioning is just target practice. He was a great king. He died like a common soldier. And the civilization he came to protect did not survive his death by a generation. That is not a story about one bad decision. That is a story about how the virtues that build a reputation can become, in a single afternoon, the exact mechanism of its destruction. Muret is not remembered the way Agincourt is remembered, or Hastings, or Tours. It sits in the footnotes of Crusade history, overshadowed by the Holy Land campaigns, underestimated because the losing side has largely been written out of the story. But what happened on the Garonne on September 12th, 1213 shaped southern France for centuries. It ended a culture. It decided a faith. And it was decided in an afternoon by 800 men and one king who rode into a melee without anyone knowing his face. When you imagine yourself as one of Simon's knights, gates opening, 30,000 men ahead of you, do you ride out? And if you do, is it courage that moves you, or something you cannot quite name, something closer to the decision that there is nothing left to lose? If this video reached something in you, subscribe to the Clash of Ancients. We cover the battle's history berries. Share it with someone who thinks they know the Crusades. And drop a comment. Was Peter II a brave king destroyed by one bad decision? Or was Muret inevitable the moment he underestimated Simon de Montfort? I want to know what you think. This has been the Clash of Ancients. Some fields remember what was done on them longer than the men who did it. And I will see you in the next one.